And it's such a beautiful day for us to be doing this today, right? Because it's the feast of Saints Joachim and Anne, and we're here at the Parish of the Visitation, and so, we've got all of this family and extended family and everything being celebrated today, so that's wonderful. And I'm thrilled to be here because of all the exciting things happening in this diocese. I think that, having this pastoral focus on family, on sexuality, on how to build healthy families is absolutely crucial because so many of the wounds of our society are right there. And so I'm happy to do my part in helping with this. As we go through this first talk, I'm doing the second talk first. This will be the longest talk. I don't know if there'll be really time for questions afterwards, but please do write down any questions you have because the other talks are shorter and there will be ample time for questions after those talks. And you'll also have time to talk at the group table as you see. So I'm going to start by talking about the current situation, basically, which is a situation of the fallout of the sexual revolution. And so we're going to look at that for a little bit. In Familiaris Consortio, the exhortation by Pope Saint John Paul II, he emphasizes this situation that we have. And he said the historical situation in which the family lives is an interplay of light and darkness. And this first talk is a little more about the darkness, but there is light, right? So I don't want you to feel it's all dark, but it's really important to understand really what we're dealing with, I think. Because when you understand what you're dealing with, then you can propose solutions that fit the problem. So first of all, what is it when we say, sexual revolution? Here's our happy flower children. And what are the kind of things people associate with the sexual revolution? They associate things like freedom, things like liberation. And what this means concretely is no strings attached sex, right? And that's what we'll see as we look at this. With the sexual revolution of the 60s, there's really a move to separate sex from procreation. With the sexual revolution of the 90s and up till today, there's really a move to separate sex from love. And so both of the meanings of the sexual act, which I'll talk about in another talk in more detail, both of those meanings are being severed from sex. So sex is becoming more and more essentially recreation, except it doesn't work. And that's what we'll look at, that it really, people can't actually live this way, but they try. And so, how well does this work? Here's some comments on the sexual revolution. This is Jane, who's 20-something. I see more freedom staying with one person who I feel I can explore all the possibilities with than from going from bed to bed to bed. I think the sexual revolution was a big joke. I really do. And more young people actually express ideas like this. So this is Paula Kamen, who's a secular sociologist, on this, wrote a book on this, and she said, even those with the most promiscuous pasts gave the sexual revolution of the 70s and the 80s a very mixed review, inclined toward the negative. You don't actually find, even among people who are living the most promiscuous kinds of lifestyles, you don't find a sort of unadulterated cheerleading of the sexual revolution, which is interesting to know. So what's part of the problem? Part of the problem is you've got a misunderstanding of freedom, that word that kept coming up. So here's John Paul II again. At the root of these negative phenomena, there frequently lies a corruption of the idea and the experience of freedom, conceived not as a capacity for realizing the truth of God's plan for marriage and the family, that's the real meaning of freedom, but rather as an autonomous power of self-affirmation, often against others, for one's own selfish well-being. Okay, so there's this understanding that if I've got to be free, that means I've got to have lots of choices. It's like this consumerist idea of choice, Coke versus Pepsi or something. I have to have all my options, and that's freedom. And as we'll see, especially in the other talks, that's a very narrow and inadequate understanding of freedom. Freedom is not just a matter of Pepsi versus Coke. It's a lot deeper. I want to start, though, not talking about how we misuse our freedom with sex. I want to talk about something that's a little broader, namely what technology is doing in our lives. And this is, I think, something that can kind of hit home for all of us, right? Because, I think even those of us who are trying hard to practice the church's sexual teachings might fall into unhelpful patterns in our use of technology. And I really think the two are connected because it has to do with how we use our freedom, how we view other people, and our relationships to other people. Because what technology is doing, the way our sexual activity does something to our relationships as a whole, right? Depending on how we use our bodies for sex. How we use our time with technology also impacts our relationships as a whole. So I just want to look briefly at that for a little bit. There's a fabulous book, Alone Together, which I highly recommend. It was actually published about 10 years ago, so a lot of it's already a little bit out of date, but it's still very relevant. So she's talking to Audrey, who's 16. She says, texting is preferable to calling. Why? Because in a phone call, there's a lot less boundness to the person. And Turkle comments, by this she means that in a call, she could learn too much or say too much, and things could get out of control. What comes up in Turkle's book over and over and over again, and she's talking to a lot of teenagers and college students, but it's also true of people older, is that we use technology to control our relationships very carefully. I will give this much and no more. I will be this intimate and no more. You know, if I text, I can stop, I can edit, I only have to say so much. On my Facebook page, I only have to post so much, and it's always the good stuff. Have you noticed? Like, you know, people never post the picture of themselves like yelling at their kids, right? It's always like the happy, smiling picture of the beach, right? We have these very carefully curated expressions of ourself that technology enables us to control. And this is going to be a theme that's going to come up over and over and over again, our burning passion to control things, right? So it definitely comes up in technology. She talked to somebody who did Second Life. I don't know if that's still out there, but it's one of these like things where you build this Second Life online. And this guy said, Second Life gives me a better relationship than I have in real life. This is where I feel most myself. Jade, who is his avatar lover, accepts who I am. Okay, so to understand what this is a married man with a couple kids who spends a huge percent of his time online in Second Life, building up a second life that has nothing to do with his real life. In Second Life, he's married to somebody who's not, of course, his real life wife, right? And he admits in the book, he doesn't even actually know if the person behind Jade is a woman. He doesn't actually know who this person is at all. He has no idea what this person looks like in real life, in flesh and blood life. But he finds his life online preferable to his life in the real world, and thinks that his avatar lover, who might be, you know, a 70-year-old man for all he knows, right, knows him better than his own wife. And Turco comments, the ironies are apparent. An avatar who has never seen or spoken to him in person, and to whom he appears in a body nothing like his own, seems to him most accepting of his truest self. I think this really, if you understand that we are drawn to this kind of experience, you can understand a lot about what kind of problems we're having in relationships in general, right? People are not connecting at their real self. They might not even know what their real self is. Okay, so this has huge implications for how we live our sexual relationships. So of course, it's easy to see how you move from having an avatar wife in, you know, some second life to having non-existent sexual relationships with people that you've never met in real life. And of course, that is what pornography does. And I'm not going to spend a huge lot of time on pornography. That's its own talk, right? The whole issues and problems of pornography and pornography addiction. You probably know that pornography addiction is very widespread. When, you know, people survey Christian congregations, the numbers, the percentages are more or less comparable to people outside of Christian congregations when it comes to pornography use. And so it's not something that the church is insulated from by any means. Here's one comment by a psychologist on this issue. And he said, in my experiences as a sexual therapist, any individual who regularly masturbates to pornography is at risk of becoming in time a sexual addict, as well as conditioning himself into having a sexual deviancy. In time, the high obtained from masturbating to pornography becomes more important than real-life relationships, like our Second Life avatar house husband, right? It's the same kind of situation where these fake relationships become even more important than the real thing. So how does some of this get manifested? So there's the phenomenon of hooking up. There's a book I highly recommend called Premarital Sex in America, which is about premarital sex in America. It's by, do I give that? I don't have it there. Oh golly, I'm blanking out on their names, but I'll remember it. It came out about 5 years ago. It is like the authoritative text on what's going on, and the people who wrote it are really sharp and have a really good kind of worldview. One thing to realize is that it's a bit of a myth that hooking up is sort of a widespread phenomenon. So essentially what hooking up is severing that second meaning of the sexual act, namely love, from sex. And so you've got quote unquote friends with benefits, right? People with whom you ostensibly are going to have no emotional connection with, but with whom people are having some kind of sexual relationship, whether it's actually intercourse or not. And so it's, in other words, fully acknowledge that this will be a sexual relationship with no emotional commitment involved. That's the theory. So the question is, how much does this happen? This is from Premarital Sex in America, which looks at 20 to 24-year-old age cohort, which is called the emerging adult cohort. 29% of men and 18% of women had such non-romantic sexual relationships. Those who hooked up generally did it on average once a year. So to have people who are hooking up every weekend is really definitely on the extreme end of the spectrum. 50% of hookups do not involve intercourse. Men are 45% more likely than women to disrespect their sexual partner afterwards. And we'll see that this is actually a trend in all kinds of ways. 53% of women felt disrespected after a hookup. I would venture that the percentage is probably higher, but that's not the kind of thing that's easy to psychologically to acknowledge to yourself, right? So probably that was even higher. 24% of men felt disrespected afterward. So what's one conclusion about this? This is another secular woman talking, about this whole phenomenon. Guys have no doubt that they are the winners in the hookup culture. She interviewed lots of undergrads, and all the guys basically felt like they were winning this. What puzzles older adults, and even girls themselves when they're being honest, is why incredibly smart, talented, and seemingly confident young women would let themselves be used when what they're doing isn't making them particularly happy. So when I talked about earlier about how there's a widespread sense of discontentment with the sexual revolution, even among people who are engaging in the behaviors that the sexual revolution really promotes, this is the kind of thing that comes up over and over and over again, that even girls who are engaging in the hookup culture don't like it, and realize when they're being honest with themselves that it's not making them happy, actually. And we'll talk a little bit about why then they would actually do this. Here's Caitlin. This is from Premarital Sex in America. You want the upper hand, period. Once you really start caring for them, then they might flip it and start caring less for you. It's so messy. I've not had the upper hand at some points, and those moments in my relationships are usually the parts where they're treating me bad. It's horrible. Okay, so this is Caitlin's assessment of the post-sexual revolution state. And so the interview's asked, why try to always have the upper hand? Aren't people trying to fashion a relationship that's mutually enjoyable? And Caitlin responds, that's the idea. If I talked about my spouse, it's going to be completely and utterly equal. But ever since I started dating, one person has always liked the other person more. And she doesn't want to be that person, right? Because if you like the other person more, you're vulnerable, you're going to get hurt. And what we'll see is that over and over and over again, emerging adults express the fact that they want this kind of mutual relationship, but that's not what they're doing now. And they somehow have this vague sense that they can move from what they're doing now to a relationship that's completely equal. How? By some kind of magic, apparently, right? There's not a strong sense that you build habits of relating by what you're doing now, right? That's going to carry over to your marriage relationships. There tends to be this magical thinking that says, well, I can just turn on a dime and everything will be different once I get married, once I have that ring on my finger. And of course, that's not realistic. So the authors of Premarital Sex in America comment, clearly such power imbalances can't work long term. Mutual self-giving must eventually emerge, it would seem, and ideas about upper and lower hands must disappear or else the relationship is doomed. I just remember the names of the authors, Regnerus and Euchre. So Mark Regnerus and Jeremy Euchre wrote this book. Okay, so I'm not going to go through these numbers individually, but the basic point of this is to see that the green are non-romantic, in other words, like hookup type relationships, and the pink bars are romantic relationships. And what they're saying about the relationships being doomed, we know from statistics. So here's like a one-day relationship through, over a year. Non-romantic relationships just don't last very long. And that shouldn't surprise us, right? Whereas the romantic relationships are only a quarter of them are lasting over a year, but they're the ones that have the greatest likelihood of lasting, and we'll look at even at other factors that make relationships last. Okay, so what are some of the fallouts of this situation of the sexual revolution? Regnerus and Euchre coined this term sexual economics, which I think is very, very helpful. They say, let's look at how relationships work in terms of kind of supply and demand. And I think there's actually a lot we can learn from this. They argue, and I think they give lots of empirical evidence for this, men want sex more than women, right? There's all kinds of biological reasons for this, as well as cultural reasons, but the biological reasons are really fundamental. And you see it in all of the surveys, right? They express greater desire for sex, they want sex more often, there's just clearly more desire there. That means that for men, the price of sex can be high, right? If you really want something, you're willing to pay more for it, right? You really want that iPad, you're willing to pay $500, right? As opposed to settling for the generic knockoff tablet at $200, right? So the iPads can set their price, Apple can set their price higher because they know some people really want what they have. All right, so that's the situation for men vis-a-vis sex. This makes women the sexual gatekeepers. You think pre-sexual revolution, right? What's kind of the scenario that was very common, right? Men want sex with a given woman. Woman says, no, you've got to marry me first, right? Women are the ones who get to say no. That makes them the sexual gatekeepers. And that is still basically the situation that, by and large, it's the men who are asking, and the women who get to respond yes or no. So, what's happened today, though? The market price, quote unquote, for sex is actually not high, which is interesting. Even though men are willing to pay a lot, right? And by pay a lot, that might mean I'm willing to actually marry you, right? Which is something that women tend to want more than men. Also, statistics indicate, right? Women tend to want marriage more, and men tend to want sex more. Women could ask a high price, and men would pay it. But today, surprisingly, even though men are willing to generally pay a higher price, the price of sex is low. Well, how has this happened? This is Premarital Sex in America. This kind of summarizes this. Women do not pay for sex. Even when you're talking about money, right? When you're talking about where you find sex being paid for with money, it's almost always men who are doing the paying, right? You do have, as they say, there are male prostitutes to be sure, but their clients are almost always other men. So they say this not to say that it's a good thing to pay for sex with actual money, right? But to point out the fact that this really exemplifies the fact that in this, there is this kind of economics here in which men value sex a lot more than women. All right, so what makes sex cheap? So two things, and they're closely connected, which have to do with the sexual revolution, namely contraception and abortion strongly significantly drove down the price of sex in the 60s and then 70s. Okay? How? Because why could women say, you've got to marry me? How could the price of sex remain high when contraception and abortion were not widespread? What was it? What impacted women more than men? Pregnancy, right? And so women could say, no, I know what serious consequences all of this has, and I know they impact me a heck of a lot more than they impact you, Joe Smith, right? And so therefore, this is not a cheap act for me. And so they could afford to set the price of sex high. Now contraception and abortion come in, and all of a sudden, it seems as though pregnancy is now taken off the table. Right? Joe Smith comes back and says, whoa, I hope nobody here's named Joe Smith. Joe Smith comes back and says, what are you talking about? You can just go on the pill. And if anything happens, I'll pay for an abortion. And so now women are left like, ooh. And it becomes a lot harder to say, well, do you respect my dignity? You know, like all of those things that are much more abstract are not nearly so easy to use as bargaining tools. And so now the price of sex has become very cheap. And now women have a lot of competition because there's a lot of women who have become more willing to give in to Joe Smith's demand, right, for sex, because they think, well, I can do it at least and not get pregnant. And so now the women who don't want to have sex before marriage, there's a lot fewer guys around who feel like they have to wait. Right? So now all of a sudden you've got a disruption in the market system, you know, using our analogy. Also social norms then, following from that. So, you know, you just look at dress, right, at clothing, now versus 100 years ago or 200 years ago or whatever. And I mean, I'm clearly not the person who says, you know, you have to have a skirt to your ankle or whatever. But, I mean, you can argue that there's, you know, been a devolution in our social norms when it comes to sexuality, where sex has become very cheap. It's become kind of omnipresent. And a big part of this is pornography, right? So now men have ready access via the magic of the internet, right? Ready access to naked women and to visions of sexual acts happening that don't have to involve another person at all. And all you have to do is, you know, click on your browser, right? So it's very omnipresent. That drives down the price of sex. So here's a quote from Naomi Wolf, who's no, you know, Catholic moral theologian or anything, but she recognized and even put in economic terms what pornography has done. She said, when I came of age in the 70s, it was still pretty cool to be able to offer a young man the actual presence of a naked, willing young woman. There were more young men who wanted to be with naked women than there were naked women on the market. The price of sex was high. I have young women experience the continual mission creep of how pornography has lowered their sense of their own sexual value and their actual sexual value. You know, instead of being able to say, marry me, and then you get to be in the presence of a naked young woman, men can say, well, forget that. That price is way too high. I'm going to go click on Firefox, right, and be in the presence of a naked young woman. So that's part of what our culture has done to these sexual interactions. So what are some of the aftershocks of this? Why do women who mostly want affection as opposed to sex, why do they give in? So here's Anna, who's 19. I guess I want affection, and I want someone to think of me a lot. I figure that if a guy isn't really interested and I put out, he will stay longer and get to know me, and then realize that I'm a decent person and we'll have a relationship. What you see over and over and over again in premarital sex in America is that men see sex as the goal, women see sex as the means. Sex is the means to affection. Sex is the means to a relationship. Sex is not the primary thing, and this is true even of the most promiscuous women. You know, women who report the highest numbers of sexual partners, they still say that what they ultimately want is relationship. And so sex becomes a tool. Okay, he's asking, instead of saying, no, you know, wait till we have that relationship, wait till we're married, the women think, well, you know, if I want the relationship, maybe I have to go ahead and say yes. The problem is, it doesn't work. And so, as the authors say, women who have sex on the first date are not considered marriageable, by and large, by men. But those who wait are. Men view women as less attractive after first intercourse. One of the worst things a woman can do to promote a relationship is to give in to a demand for sex quickly. It's the thing that's most likely to actually kill the possibility of a relationship. Because when that happens, the men who are in that relationship say, this woman, she's not marriageable. You know, she's disposable. We know that sex bonds chemically, and we'll talk a little bit about that, but it is not strong enough to simply either make or save a relationship. Okay? It builds and supports a relationship when those relationships are positive, but it cannot be the glue that holds a relationship together, but women still hope that it will be. So as they conclude in this book, the early to sex pattern, meaning women who have relationships in which sex happens quickly, erodes the stability of sexual relationships. These are the relationships that are most likely to end. So what happens when you wait? If you have sex on the first day, on a first date, only 14% of those couples are in a relationship a year later. Those who waited 1 to 2 months to have sex, 26% of them are in a relationship a year later. Waiting more than 6 months, 35% of them are in a relationship a year later. Okay, so actually waiting actually helps make a relationship more stable. What are some of the other effects that happen? And these have everything to do with what actually biologically happens. So the myth of the hookup culture, for example, is that somehow we are capable of human beings of going in and being sexually intimate with somebody else and then being able to walk away. No strings. Like somehow all we have to do is decide that this is going to be an unemotional relationship, and then it will be. You know, we tend to have like a strong belief in sort of just the power of our brute will to do this. The thing is that everything about a sexual relationship works against this. So biologically, this is actually a very difficult and almost impossible thing to do. Why? So first of all, during sex, you have oxytocin released. Oxytocin, as many of you know, is a bonding hormone. It's the kind of thing that is released during pregnancy, during labor, during breastfeeding, especially in the mother. You have all of this being released. It bonds her with her baby. Oxytocin is also released during sexual activity. Dopamine is released. Dopamine is a reward hormone. Dopamine is the kind of thing that, you know, when joggers get a running high, which I never have, it's the kind of thing that makes them want to still jog. That's why I don't still jog, because I never get a running high. Right? Dopamine rewards you and creates these neural pathways in your brain that make you want to repeat the same action over and over again. Right? So when people when that psychologist was talking about masturbating to pornography, you know, you're creating pathways, you're creating reward pathways in your brain, and that's why people can become addicted to sex, right? Even though, I mean, you get similar sort of chemical reactions in your brain that you get with things like heroin. You know, it's actually with pornography, they say both upper reactions and downer reactions both happen, and so you kind of have like, you know, both things like heroin and things like cocaine kind of, you know, firing away in your brain at the same time. Pheromones. Pheromones are airborne hormones, and the kind of things that that we all just naturally, you know, excrete. It's the stuff they think that when girls are raised with their biologically related fathers, right, it tends to suppress puberty until later. It's because of the father's pheromones, they've determined, are released. So pheromones help form sexual attraction. And so you wind up bonding and wanting to continue to have sex with somebody because of pheromones, even if your brain says, no, I don't want to keep, this person treats me terribly, or, you know, we said we was just going to be something casual. Well, like your body is actually working against that, helping form your emotions. And so, as somebody summarized it, the brain can't tell the difference between a broken bone and a broken heart. When a sexual relationship abruptly ends, you have a lot of the same kind of traumatic reactions that you do when you have a physical trauma, because your body is involved. It's not just in your head, quote unquote. It is in your head, and it's in your body, and it's kind of everywhere. Your whole person is involved in these relationships. Of course, your body can be very directly affected by sexually transmitted infections and other diseases. So you've probably seen these statistics. The CDC, 25% of girls, basically teenage girls, have some kind of sexually transmitted infection, so that's a quarter. This study, very scary. Over 18 months, over 50% of students at a high school were linked through sexual relationships. Meaning, even if you had a person who was only having sex with her boyfriend, right? Well, if her boyfriend has had previous sexual encounters, and these could be not only intercourse, but oral sex and other kinds of sexual relationships, if that person had sexual encounters with other people, that girl is linked to all these other people and so forth, and they found that basically it was over 50% of them had contact with the rest of the population through these chains. And the scary thing is that women are more susceptible to being infected than men. A lot of people don't know this, and it's not communicated very well. And the reason is that there's simply just more surface area to become infected with a woman than with a man. So a woman is more likely in the act of intercourse to be infected with a disease than a man is, including HIV. So condoms, right? Do condoms help, right? Well, the CDC has said that condoms are actually not effective against certain kinds of infections at all. And those infections include HPV, human papillomavirus, and herpes. Why? Because these are the kinds of diseases that cause lesions that can be in places that aren't just covered by condoms, right? And so mere skin-to-skin contact, which can include then not even intercourse. Like these could be people who aren't even having intercourse and they could get herpes from somebody else, right? Because you can have these diseases transmitted through lesions. So condoms simply aren't effective against those, and they're not very effective against other diseases for reasons I can talk about in the Q&A. Oral sex, of course, is a big, it is considered to often be a good substitute. Planned Parenthood promotes things like oral sex because people don't get pregnant from it, right? But look at all the different diseases that oral sex itself can transmit. And people are even less likely to use a condom when it comes to oral sex than with regular intercourse. And so you have a bunch of behaviors that are being engaged in that are just not, from a public health perspective, just not healthy for people, right? You're encouraging a culture in which disease will be transmitted. Why do we have this culture? This is what we get when we think that female fertility is the problem, right? If the sexual revolution is trying to make sex essentially recreation, the big thing that stands in the way is female fertility. And so you can tell, you think, why is Planned Parenthood so kind of blasé about the fact that they're promoting a lifestyle that communicates all these diseases? And they'll say, use condoms and all that kind of stuff, but still, they're really out there. You can tell their heart's not in it, right? When it comes to campaigning against disease, that's not really what they care about. Well, why? What does Planned Parenthood care about? Planned Parenthood cares about pregnancy, right? And so as long as, they're out there providing the pill and abortions, they don't really care that much if people are getting diseases, because that's our mindset, that the real problem is female fertility. And we'll kind of take everything else as collateral damage as long as we can neutralize female fertility. That's really the mindset. But the sad thing is, even on its own terms, the lifestyle of the sexual revolution is not very good at preventing pregnancy. So 3 in 10 girls are going to get pregnant by age 20. And virtually all women, age 15 to 44, who have ever had sexual intercourse have used at least one contraceptive method. But only 51% of them use contraceptive, quote unquote, all the time. Okay, so we have a society that has been saturated with contraception, right? If you've got 99% of people who are contraceptively experienced, who are sexually active, then that means that everybody knows about contraception. Yet, roughly only about half of them want to use it. all the time. Okay, so what contraception has done is to somehow give us the sense that we can have sex without getting pregnant, but not actually delivered on that promise. Because when push comes to shove, people aren't actually that enthusiastic about using contraception and using it well. So the Kaiser Family Foundation, nearly all teens, 15 to 19, who have had sex report using at least one method of birth control. The most common methods were condoms and birth control pills. So when we see the statistic that 3 in 10 girls are going to get pregnant by age 20, it's not because they don't know about contraception. And it's not because they haven't actually even used it before. It's because what contraception has done is simply break down the barriers. Contraception has simply made the price of sex low. But it hasn't actually turned teenagers into the people who can use contraception. We have studies on the people who use contraception well. In other words, they take it every day, they're very conscientious, they take their pill when they're supposed to, et cetera, et cetera. Those people are 30-something married women. We have studies on teenagers and on how well they use contraception. Doesn't matter how much you educate them, they just don't use contraception well. I don't know, has anybody had a teenager, know a teenager, been a teenager? Yeah, me too. Okay, so if you've had experience with teenagers, right, there's certain characteristics of adolescent psychology that mitigate against using contraception well, right? And you can probably think what those are if you think back to your own past, magical thinking, it won't happen to me, an inability to kind of, future events are very vague as opposed to the here and now. There's lots of characteristics of adolescent psychology that make them lousy users of the birth control pill, say, or condoms. And no amount of talking at them and handing out, cupcake flavored condoms, no amount of doing that is going to change them from adolescents to 30-something married women. It's just not, right? So all the talking at them does is make them think, A, having sex outside of marriage is an okay thing, and B, somehow I can do it and not get pregnant, right? And it doesn't have to happen to me, except that it does, over and over and over again. But it's not only adolescents. So 54% of women seeking abortions use contraception in the same month. And only 8% of women seeking abortions have never used contraception. So again, we have a contraceptively saturated society, and it is not actually preventing pregnancies. There's links between contraception and abortion that you can find over and over and over again. One of the most common arguments you hear from people about contraception, so it's what I call the Nancy Pelosi argument, because she kind of waves her feeble pro-life flag when it's useful Catholic flag and says, well, you of course, if you're Catholic, you would support funding of Planned Parenthood, right? Because if you want to prevent abortions, you want us to pay for birth control, right? Because preventing abortions is so important. And I think this is actually compelling to a lot of Catholics. You find a lot more people who are pro-life than anti-contraception, right? And they really do want to prevent abortions. And they think, well, wouldn't it be a good thing that people are on birth control so that we don't have unplanned pregnancies, so we don't have abortions? The problem is, it doesn't work. There's actually a correlation between higher contraception use and higher abortion rates. So let's look at some of those. So in America, increasing access to contraception may actually increase long-run pregnancy rates. Policies that decrease contraception may lower pregnancy rates in the long run. In Spain, a 63% increase in the use of contraceptives was accompanied by a 108% increase in the rates of elective abortions. More contraception use, more abortion. In Britain, providing more family planning clinics has actually led to an increase in pregnancies. Why? Because people don't actually use contraception like robots. We provide them more contraception. What they do is engage in more risky sexual behavior, in more sexual behavior outside of the confines of a loving marriage that could support a pregnancy. And it creates this attitude in our minds, well, I have a right to sex without pregnancy. And it's simply going to happen. I can just assume, because everybody tells me it will. Sex without pregnancy, that's the deal. And what happens if it doesn't happen? What happens if a person gets pregnant? Well, they're totally unprepared for that situation. And so what do? They go to the backup contraception, which is abortion. So you foster, through contraception, more risky sexual behavior, more sexual behavior outside of committed relationships. You're going to foster more abortion, because abortion will be needed to clean up the mess of these crisis pregnancies. So instead of contraception eliminating the possibility of single motherhood, as you know, has skyrocketed since the sexual revolution. Contraception actually facilitates this, because all contraception does is break down the idea in our head that sex should be in marriage. It lowers the price of sex. And what we get is our culture. It comes out in all kinds of interesting ways. The fact that people feel more and more pressured to have sex. 78% of women testify to being pressured into some kind of unwanted sexual activity. 58% of men, which it kind of surprises me that it's that high. Here, this is taken straight from Rigorous and Euchre Premarital Sex in America, and I won't go through all of these numbers, but basically what you have, you've got on either side of a dash there, women who have, so this is the lifetime numbers of sexual partners, and you've got women on the one side and men on the other side, and here's a bunch of kind of standard symptoms of depression, right? These are kind of the standard sort of things that psychologists and social workers see. All right, so look at people who have never had a lifetime sexual partner. They're the people who score the highest on the good things, like being satisfied with life, and the lowest on the bad things, like crying every day, right? They're the people who tend to be psychologically the most well-balanced, followed closely by people who've only had one lifetime sexual partner, okay? The people who are living the most promiscuous lifestyles score the lowest on the good things and the highest on the bad things. Look, people who've never had a sexual partner, women, are about 10% of them depressed, about 5% of men. 32% of women who have had 11 or more sexual partners are depressed, whereas 10% of men are. Okay, so, I mean, it's just very clear that the more sexual partners you have, the worse you're doing in life from like a psychological perspective. It's also very interesting that women are more impacted than men. Women tend more to depression, at least to being diagnosed with it, than men do anyway. But, you know, again, 32% of women in this category have been diagnosed with depression as opposed to more like 11% of men. So women are definitely psychologically impacted more seriously. And so here's Olivia. When this relationship ended, it hurt so much. I think about him all the time, and I haven't been going to one of my classes because he'll be there and I can't handle seeing him. I was so unprepared for all of this. Why do they tell you how to protect your body, but they don't tell you what it does to your heart? And, you know, I mean, anybody who works in a university setting knows that sexual activity is just a disaster, especially for the women. Even if they're not breaking up, you know, they're distracted, it pulls them away from their schoolwork. It's just, there's all kinds of, you know, really adverse lifestyle things that happen when women are in sexual relationships. Out of all of this, then, we clearly have a decrease in marriage. Any of you who work in marriage prep, what percentage of people do you think are cohabiting who come in? 95? Anybody else? Any other numbers?
I'd say 99.
99? It's very high. And these are the people who are coming to the church to get married, right? So it's the social barriers against cohabitation have totally broken down. All right, so let's see what cohabitation does. Cohabitation increases your chance of divorce by roughly 50%. Let me say that again. Cohabitation increases your chance of divorce by roughly 50%. How many of the couples coming into marriage prep would say that they cohabited in order to, you know, test drive and everything to make sure this was really the one, to make their marriage better, et cetera, et cetera? None of these people are cohabiting so that they'll divorce later, right? That's not in their mind, especially the women. The women think that this is the strategy to keep from divorcing. It is not, and we'll talk about why. What else does cohabiting do? Cohabiting harms children. About 40% of cohabiting households have children, either the biological parents, but even more likely you've got an unrelated boyfriend in the household who's not the parent of the child. After 5 years, 1/2 of these relationships will break up. Cohabiting, I know, marriage isn't doing hot these days, but cohabiting relationships are much more volatile and transient than married relationships. They break up faster and more often than married relationships. So after 5 years, 15% of married partners will break up. So it's a very disruptive environment for children. It is also the environment in which things like physical and sexual abuse are the highest. And it's a very dangerous environment for children. You think about it, you've got a boyfriend who moves in. The mom there has, say, 2 kids, maybe from 2 other guys, whom the boyfriend's not likely to think very fondly of anyway, right? Suppose you've got a baby and a toddler who are, he doesn't have any bonding experience with. They're not why he's with the mom, right? He's not like, oh yeah, I want to be a dad to you. No, that's not why he's there, right? These kids are at best nuisances very often in these kinds of relationships. And so the possibility of abuse can be very, very high in cohabiting relationships, and that includes sexual abuse, very sadly. So Jennifer Rollback-Morse cohabited and has thought about this, and she says, no one can simulate self-giving. Half a commitment is no commitment. Cohabiting couples have one foot out the door throughout the relationship. They rehearse not trusting, right? That's the deal with cohabitation. You can leave, right? That's the deal. It's not marriage precisely because there's no commitment. It looks like marriage in every other respect, except there's no commitment. And so what does that mean? You're living with somebody, you're practicing not committing. Is that a good preparation for marriage? Right? In which you've got to learn to commit when it gets tough. The deal with cohabitation is you can leave when it gets tough, right? It's really interesting. Cohabiting couples, part of the reason they move together is for money and, they might save on rent, but you look at things like household goods. Cohabiting couples have 2 of everything. They've got 2 sets of silverware, 2 TVs. Why? If he leaves, you need silverware, right? They don't have the confidence in the relationship that they're going to dump a TV and get rid of the silverware, right? It could end tomorrow. And so their whole household is actually kind of structured around the fact that they are not committing to this person. So it's like a terrific rehearsal for divorce, which is in fact what happens when cohabiting couples do marry, which is by no means a given. Even though a lot of women enter into the situation hoping that that's what's going to happen. So, in all of this, where does marriage stand? And if you look at Regnerus and Euchre, it's kind of fascinating because so they're interviewing emerging adults, 20-somethings, and one of the data points that they have is whether or not this cohort wants to get married. What do you think the percentage is of how many of them want to get married?
Are they religious or not?
Just all across the board. How much? 90? I heard 60. Okay. So the answer is 95%, which astonishes me. It really, that marriage still has such a hold on people that they're still not, essentially all of them say that they want to get married. The interesting thing, though, is how they actually view marriage. So, here's the question. What do you want out of marriage? Just to have a good ending to my life, basically. And so, what you have is this kind of very magical thinking, and it's why they put off marriage, longer and longer. Why? Because marriage is when your life ends. And this comes out over and over and over again when they talk about it, right? It's like, I've got to do all that fun stuff. I've got to travel. I've got to do this, and then I'll get married. And that's like when you finish things up. It's like the necessary icing on the cake. And the funny thing is, like, you look at people in their 20s, say, when they're not married, in previous generations when they were getting married. There's a great book on this, by the way, called The Defining Decade, which just is really wonderful about the 20s. You look at people in their 20s, they don't actually do all that stuff, right? Unless they happen to have wealthy parents, they probably don't travel that much. They're probably working in a dead-end job, right? They don't have the money to travel, right? They're not actually doing much out of the stuff that they, when are they going to do that stuff? When they get married, right? Because what we know is when people marry, and we'll talk about this, they're they score better on all sorts of things, health, happiness, but also wealth. Marriage makes you happier, healthier, and wealthier for all kinds of reasons that we can talk about. And so the only time where they actually could probably accumulate the capital to do all that fun stuff is after they're married, right? So they probably shouldn't be putting it off so much. But it's good to know that that's what's in people's mindsets, and that includes those cohabiting couples, They just think marriage is something you do at the end of your life, not when you're living your life. So, just to kind of wind this up, we started with this idea of freedom. And of course, the sexual revolution is premised on this promise of freedom. What it will give us all, right, is this unfettered freedom. But as we're going to see, the church is going to keep arguing over and over again, what really is freedom? Freedom means that you are free enough to give. It's not about having all your options lined up on the table, all your sexual partners and so forth. Freedom, true freedom, means the freedom to give of yourself. And when all we do is, live life kind of frantically pursuing one pleasure after another, we get the stuff that chart showed as far as, being depressed and crying every day and, all of those sort of undesirable outcomes, because that's not what we're meant to be. We can't be happy that way. So, whenever Marika says you should, we are going to have some time for table discussion, and something you can talk about anything you want, of course, but some things to maybe think about are, which of these trends do you see here in this area, or in the area of your surroundings? And what if this was new? We all kind of know sort of doom and gloom, things are bad, right? But was there anything specific that was new that you're like, this is really helpful. Now that I know this, I can engage in certain, pastoral or evangelical relationships differently now based on this information. So I think we'll go ahead and do the discussion now. And so if you had any questions, please do write them down, because I will take them after one of these.